Hey, I hope y'all are doing well. Today we're going to be taking a look at getting controller velocity and being able to use it within our XRGrab interactables. And specifically, we're going to be looking at getting controller velocity via Unity's input system, but I'll also be showing an example of a interactable where we'll be getting the velocity of our controller and then we'll be changing the color of the held object. So I hope that sounds good. Let's go ahead and let's get started. And I already have a basic project set up. It's just in Unity 2020. I have OpenXR and XR Toolkit already set up. And so this video doesn't go on too long. I've already created a couple of scripts that I've just called controller velocity and velocity interactable, which both of them are just empty mono behaviors. But I have attached them to some objects within our scene. If we go to this grab interactable, you'll see that I have the controller velocity script already attached to it. And then if we go to our XR rig, for the left and the right hand controller, I've attached the controller velocity script to it. Now what we're going to be doing with this script within controller velocity, we're going to be giving it an input action that we're going to create in a second. And then once this interactable controller setup grabs this interactable object, we're going to be reading that value and then doing an operation with it. And this may not be the most optimum setup, but I usually like setting things up like this because it makes it easier for my logic where I don't have to differentiate between something as the left or the right hand controller. You may be thinking that I can just put the action right on the interactable object, but then you would have to figure out once the left controller or the right controller grabs it, and that's just kind of a pain because once you start to write logic like that, it's probably something that's going to flood out into other parts of your project. So obviously we don't want to do that. But if we were a bit more industrious, we could create a custom controller solution for this, but that's a little bit more difficult and iffy to do and may not actually make the logic simpler to do. So let's first get the velocity from our controller. And we're going to do that by going to our input manager. And we're just going to go to our default input actions. We'll double click that. And I've already created a simple action map here that I've just called velocity. And I have two actions here that I've called right velocity and left velocity. And if I open these up, you'll see that I've already set up the device velocity for the XR controller. Now, when I was putting this together, this actually didn't work for me. I needed to put in the specific device velocity for whatever controller I was using. As of right now, I'm using the index, so I'm actually going to need to update this to include the device velocity specifically for an index controller. So you'll actually look or get to see how that's implemented. So let's hit this plus sign here. We'll add a binding. We'll go to our path, we'll go to our XR controller, and for me specifically, like I said, I'm going to be using the index controller, but it's not showing up right now, so I'm going to just start up SteamVR really quick to make that show up. Alright, so now that I did that, let's click on our path again, and I'm going to go to my index controller, and you'll automatically see that within the device pose, we have angular velocity, position, and velocity. So we're just going to use the normal velocity, we're not going to use the angular at the moment, so we'll just click that, and then we'll do it for our left controller as well. There we go. I think I accidentally hit the wrong one. Let's actually undo that. We want the device pose, not the pointer one. So there we go. And as of right now, this is all set up. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hit save asset. If you are curious, if you just want to try if you can use the normal device velocity of the XR controller, if you want to see where that is, let's just do that really quick as an example. We'll go all the way back here. We'll just say, we'll do specifically for the right controller, we'll do optional controls, and it's going to be this device velocity right here. But we're not going to need that right now, so let's just delete this. There we go. Now we can exit out of here, and let's actually start writing some code for this. So let's close our samples, and I'm going to open up just let's actually just open up the controller velocity script right now. So now that we're in our controller velocity script, this is actually pretty easy to do. The first thing that we're going to need to do is have a namespace for our input system. So we'll just add that. And then the first thing that we're going to do is create an input action property. And if you've seen my last video on input, it's something we didn't necessarily implement. We used input action references, I believe. And I talked about this, but we didn't really use it. So we're going to use it now just as an example, where it's going to be an input action property where we can either use a reference that we created of an action or we can sort of define it in line within the inspector itself. Now that may seem a bit confusing, but don't worry, we'll see it in practice in a bit. And right now I'm just going to call this velocity property. I honestly never know what I'm supposed to name these, but I think that's a good enough name. Because I'm never sure if it should be velocity action or something, but then if we write it out, it'd be velocity action.action, and that just kind of looks weird. But that's besides the point. We're also going to have a property that we're going to store the velocity in, and this is just because we don't necessarily need everything to be reading the action itself. Let's just read it once, store it somewhere, and then everything that needs that velocity, we'll just ask for it via that value. So we'll write a public vector3 that we'll just call velocity, not velocity. There we go. And then we'll do a public get and a private set, and we'll initialize it to vector3.0. So now that we have all that good stuff, let's write an update function, and we'll set our velocity to our velocity property action read value. And since it's a velocity, we're going to write vector3, because that's going to be the value type that we want. And that's actually it for this script. So let's go back into Unity so we can set it up. Alright, so let's go to our left and our right hand controller, and you'll see now that we have this thing in our inspector where we can either use a reference to an action or we can create one here. So if you didn't want to go through that process of doing it in the big old input action manager, you could do it here if you wanted to. But we're not going to do that. We're just going to hit use reference. And this is our left hand controller, so we're going to do velocity, left velocity. And we'll do the same for our right hand. There we go. And one thing I think I forgot to mention is I'm going to open up my actions again really quick and go to our velocity, is that it is an action type. It is going to be a value. So make sure that it's not set to button here. Just make sure it's either value. I think pass through would work as well, but just to let you know that's what I'm using. So we'll exit out of that again. And now at this point, we can technically get this component on our controller and ask the controller what its velocity is. But how can we use that in an actual interactable? If you've seen one of my previous videos, I show how to reload a shotgun using the velocity of controller to sort of flick it close. So there's a lot of cool little extra interactions you can do with velocity. So obviously we're going to need to know how to do that as well in a way that isn't too cumbersome. So let's go to our velocity interactable and let's open that up. Alright, now for this script, there isn't a ton going on, but you should probably be a little bit familiar with how to program within XR Toolkit. We're going to be using some of the events, we're going to be using the process interactable. I'll try to explain all those things as we go through it, but if you're unfamiliar with those, I do have some earlier videos that kind of go over that in more detail. But the first thing that we're going to be doing is we need our interaction toolkit namespace. So let's go to our namespaces, we'll duplicate this, and we'll say XR interaction toolkit. There we go. And we're essentially going to be adding on to our grab interactable that comes with XR toolkit. So we want to make sure that our class inherits from that. So we'll get rid of monobehavior and we'll write XR grab interactable. And then we're going to need a couple of variables. I have these variables. One of them is not necessary. It's just for the example. I'm just going to get the mesh render so we can change its color. But if you want to use this for something else, obviously we probably don't have to write that down. But we're first going to create a reference to a controller velocity component, the one we just created. And we'll just call this controller velocity. And then we just want another reference to a mesh renderer. Alright, and we're just going to get that in awake. And since we're going to be inheriting from the grab interactable, there's a lot of functions that are already defined there, so we're going to need to override them. And awake is one of them. Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code, whatever you're using, will usually show them if they're valid to be overridden. But whenever you override any of these, it should automatically do it, but make sure you're calling the awake as well, or things are just going to kind of just stop working and there's going to be no reason, rhyme or reason how. I couldn't tell you how many times I've not called the base, and for the life of me, it took a long time to figure out why something wasn't working. Okay, so we have our mesh renderer, and then we're going to need to override a couple of the events. So when we pick up this object, the object is going to ask the interactor, hey, do you have the controller velocity component? And if you do, let's get that so we can get the velocity value. And since these two functions are internal with XR Toolkit, we won't get the autocomplete. So sometimes it's advantageous for us to go to the definition of one of these guys, and then we can just copy these here. Specifically, we won't be using these, so we actually have to go even deeper. We must go deeper. And let's scroll down here to see if we can find what we're looking for. And I'm specifically going to be using onSelect entered and onSelect exited. So instead of typing this whole thing out, I'm just going to copy it. And then we'll go back and we'll go get this. We'll get this guy too. So, but I'll read them out once we get them both pasted in here. So we have onSelect entered and onSelect exited. One thing to note is if you're using one of the more recent versions of XR Toolkit, you'll be given the select enter event arguments and the select exit event arguments. And this just gives us more information than in the previous iteration of these functions. So if it just says interactor, that's fine, don't worry about it, you'll still be able to follow along, but I would suggest upgrading to a more recent version. Okay, so let's get these guys in order. So we're going to get rid of the internal and the virtual and just write override there. And then that one's going to be happy, and then we'll fix this one as well. Okay, cool. So whenever this particular object is going to be grabbed, so that's what we say when it's been selected, we want to ask the controller if it has the velocity script on it. But before we do that, we want to call the base. So make sure that piece of where that tip is already coming in handy for us here, where we got to make sure we call our base and pass in the arguments. And then we're just going to want to set our velocity component. So we can do args, which is short for arguments. We can access either the interactable or the interactor. We're specifically just going to get the interactor. And if you remember, it shares the same game object as the controller velocity as well as the controller. So we can just say get component, controller velocity. So now we actually have that component that we can use. And then we're going to do something, well, we'll actually do the opposite in onSelect exited. There we go, we'll pass in our arguments. And then we're just going to set it to null. You could probably get away with not doing this, but I'm kind of weird and I just want to do that just to be safe. Okay, so now when we select it or we pick it up, we have a reference to the component, and when we drop it, we no longer have a reference to it. But now, as the object is actually being held, let's read that velocity value and apply it to this object. So you could technically do this in an update, but we actually have a nifty function here that XR Toolkit gives us called process interactable, where it's either going to give us these different update phases for fixed or dynamic, if it's a fixed update or a normal update. But most of the time, we're just going to use the dynamic updates. So what we can do here is we can say if this object is selected, so if it's held, and if the update phase is a dynamic one, like I said, you can have fixed, late, or on before render. You could technically get away with not doing this, but it is sometimes good to sort of designate what update loop you're doing this in. And then we actually want to apply our velocities, but we need a function for that. So let's write a function here that we're just going to call private void apply velocity. There we go. And then we'll actually scroll down here a little bit, where now we're just going to call apply velocity within our process interactable. So kind of like I said, this sort of behaves like an update. So whenever the object is selected, if it's in a normal update, let's just apply the velocity to this object. But this function name may actually be a little misleading since we're not really applying the actual velocity value to move the object. So if we want to be a bit more specific with what this is doing, I'm going to rename it really quick. And we can name it something like updates color using velocity. There we go. Since that's technically more what we're doing here. And now that we're here, we can get our velocity, turn it into a color, and then we'll set our material using it. So let's create a variable that we're just going to call velocity. I keep spelling it wrong. Oh, good. Okay, I can type, I promise. And we're going to get that component, and we're going to see if it exists, because not everything that there's a possibility, or there most often than not, they're going to be interactables within your scene that don't have this component on it. Like if it's a socket or something like that. Like a socket isn't going to have any velocity, so it wouldn't make sense to have this component. So what we're going to use is a ternary operator, which is just a fancy if statement to say if we have the component, we want to read from it. So we'll say controller velocity, and we'll get our velocity value. But if we don't have anything, let's just do vector3.0. And now let's just turn this into a color. So we'll create a new color, and we'll just plug in the X, Y, and Z values into it. Y. NZ, okay. And finally, we get our mesh renderer, our material, our color, and then we just set our color. And there we go. So let's scroll up here a little bit. And that's pretty much the script in its entirety right there. And at this point, if you wanted to do a different implementation using the velocity, you could start with writing your own functionality here. All of this other stuff, with the exception of this mesh renderer, is necessary, but other than that, it is actually pretty simple to do. All right, and now that all that is done, let's go back into Unity and hopefully this works. We'll see. Okay, cool. So now that we're back in Unity, let's check our controllers. That guy looks good. This guy looks good. And our interactable, I totally put the wrong script on it. I'm glad I looked at that. Let's remove let's remove that, and let's actually use our velocity interactable. And you'll see that it pretty much looks exactly like a normal grab interactable. So let's hit save, and then let's hit play. So clearly I haven't learned my lesson in orienting my space a little bit better, because I'm going to turn around here. Alright. There we go. I got it. And you can already see that it's sort of changing color already. And as I move my controller, we're going to have a little dance party going on. Yeah, buddy. This is actually kind of fun. Alright. That's enough of our dance party. Let's put it back on the table now. That's actually it for this video. Hopefully you found it useful. If you want to see more things like this about XR Toolkit or anything in just programming and VR in general, feel free to leave a comment below. I read everything. If you want to see more videos like this, feel free to subscribe. It really helps me continue doing things like this. So I think that's it for me. I'll see you all in the next one.